Hey everyone, welcome back. So as I've been working on this course, I've referred to this section internally, it's just me, but in my head internally as GitHub Odds and Ends. I don't really think that's a fair title. There are some very important pieces in here and then some odds and ends. It's just another one of those motley sections, an assortment of topics that have to do with GitHub. So the first thing we cover is the difference between having a public and private repo and what it means. That's going to be critical, but also very easy. Then we talk about adding collaborators to repos. How do we add somebody else and give them permission to push, for example, to a project? That's going to be critical as well. You do that all the time, assuming you collaborate. We talk about README files, which is important. You may have seen this before, all caps readme.md, stands for Markdown, the MD. They play a particular role in GitHub repositories. Pretty much every repo has one, but it's not critical, important, sort of best practice. It's a good habit to get into. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's important, but not critical. Then I talk about Markdown. If you're not familiar with Markdown, it is not a Git or GitHub topic, but to make a README, we do write Markdown. So it's related. If you already know Markdown, skip that. If you don't, check it out. But remember, Markdown is a thing on its own, and it's not tied to Git and GitHub. And then two other things I'm going to say are nice to have, definitely not important or critical. A feature on GitHub called gists. That's all I'll say about it. They're nice to have, but a lot of people just don't even use them. And then GitHub Pages, a very nice to have tool from GitHub that it helps us to easily host web pages, static web pages from our repositories. So very nice to have, but also not at all critical. It's just not a feature of Git. It's a feature of GitHub, but it's one that's pleasant and it's a nice, especially if you're starting out, you want a personal site, a portfolio site, you want to demo a project, it's very useful. Anyway, again, we'll talk about it in the actual video on GitHub Pages. The main things I hope you take away from this section are really just about settings in a repo, public versus private, permissions, adding collaborators, and then some GitHub adjacent topics like Markdown and README files, GitHub Pages, worth knowing about, nice to have. They're in the course for a reason, but just not critical. Okay, I gotta shut up. Bye. So the first thing we'll talk about is the difference between public and private repositories on GitHub. Pretty straightforward. There are two settings, right? Or one setting with two options. You can make the visibility of any GitHub repository public or private, assuming that you're the owner and you have permission to make it public or private. So when you create a new repository, it prompts you with that choice. Here I have two GitHub accounts, the one I've been using, Colt, and then I made a new one for my chicken, Stevie Chicks. So that's Stevie Chicks. I'm also trying to make it clear up top. This is Stevie's account and this one's mine, because here it's somewhat easy to tell, but once we get on an actual repository page, if we're looking at the same repo, it's really hard to tell who is who. You can look at this little photo up there, but that's it. So I've put the name up top, Stevie and Colt. Anyway, if I make a new repository, we've seen that it prompts you for a name, and then here, public or private. So there's an important difference. A public repository is accessible, it's discoverable, it's clonable by anyone on the internet. They can go find your repo by searching on GitHub. They can find it by looking at your profile. They can just have the link and view it, right? Anybody can access it. That still does not mean people can change the contents of the repository. They can't push to the repository. They have to have collaborator privileges or permissions to do that, and I'll show you how to set that up. But that's a separate topic. We're purely talking about visibility. So anybody can see a public repo, but when I make something private, it's only accessible to the owner, aka me who created it, and then people who have been granted access. So they have explicitly been added as collaborators. They then have access to a private repo. Now, things work slightly differently if we're talking about an organization or enterprise level GitHub account where a private repository can be visible to everyone within the organization. But we're working with personal free accounts, so a private repo is only visible to me, the owner, and people I specifically grant access to. So let's try making, let's go with their name that they suggest, Bookish Disco, and then I'll make it public to start. Okay, I'll just we're not going to do anything in here. I'm just making this repo. So anybody can see this now. If they go to my profile, go to repositories, here it is, bookish disco. Okay, so if I copy this over, I'm in Safari, I'm in a different browser here on Stevie's account, and if I go to this URL to view Colt, that's kind of why it's confusing, right? I'm viewing somebody else's account, I see bookish disco, even though I'm logged in as somebody else. Now I don't see the same display, like here, if I go to bookish disco, I'm the owner. So I see this information about getting set up, but I also see settings. I don't see that here. I'm just a member of the public viewing the repository because it's public. All right, so speaking of settings, if you want to toggle or change that privacy, under settings for a repository, you have to be the owner, unless we're talking about an organization or enterprise level account. In that case, you don't have to be the owner, but you have to be granted permission to change the visibility. Anyway, if I want to change visibility, it's under options, which we're already on settings. And then you just scroll for a long ways down to the very bottom. We're looking for the danger zone. And then we have this right here, change repository visibility. So I'm going to change visibility just to demonstrate this. And I'm going to make it private. But it's going to ask me to type in, well, first, it actually just shows me all the changes that will happen. Anybody who is watching the repository, anybody who has starred it, you can star repositories. Like here's an example. A couple hundred people have starred this one. People are watching it. They get notifications. So if I make that private, that goes away. But then also there's some other changes that go along with making something private. I'll lose wikis and different pull requests and other things. Basically, we're going private, so anything involving the public goes away. But we don't have anything in here anyway, so I'm going to type that. It wants me to exactly type the name of the repo, so colt/bookish-disco. All right, I understand, change visibility. Now it wants my password. Okay. So now it shows up as private right here. I'm on my account as Colt, I'm the owner, so I can see that. But if I refresh this page where I'm logged in as Stevie, 404, I don't have access at all. I can't see that repository. I don't know it exists anymore. It's gone private. So that's the distinction, and that's how you change them. Generally, it's a pain if you have a public repo and you make it private. I don't recommend, having some big established repository with a whole bunch of collaborators and then going private and suddenly it's just gone. But you can do that. Okay? Generally, I go the other direction. Start something in secret, start it private so people can't see them. For example, all these horrible little dumb demo repos that we have just for this course, all these Git repos like animals, colors, chickens, GitHub demo novel. I would normally make those private and then maybe make them public, but I'm making them public because I want you to be able to see them. This is a Git course. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is collaborators. How do we add collaborators to a repo? Now that's different, right? Working with somebody on a GitHub repo is different from just making a repo public. When I say working with collaborators, I mean allowing other users to push changes to the repository. When a repo is public, anybody can take any of these public repos, not this one that we made private. They can take any of these public repos and clone them, make their own changes and commits, but they can't push them back up to my copy. Nobody can just take over a repo without me granting them permission. Otherwise, they could delete everything and then just push up an empty version. That's not how it works. I have to grant people collaboration privileges. So I'll show you how to do that. I have two accounts, right? I already explained that. I have Colt and then I have Stevie. And why don't I add Stevie to this bookish disco repository and give him permission to push? So I'm logged in as Colt, the owner. There's nothing even in here. If I go into settings, under settings, we've been here to options. This is where we change something from public to private and vice versa. We also have manage access. And this is where I can add direct access collaborators. So here's visibility, right? Only those with access can even view it in the first place. Right now, that's just me, just Colt. But I'm going to change that. I'm going to invite Stevie. So to do that, I need to know Stevie's GitHub username or his email. Now, I think if I remember, I just did Stevie Chicks like that. Yep, there he is. I'm going to click, and then I'm going to add Stevie Chicks to this repository. Okay, so that's just an invitation. So Stevie now has to actually go to his email that he signed up for GitHub with. He'll get a notification, or he'll get a message there. He has to click a link to accept the invite. So Stevie opens up his email. He clicks the link. I didn't show you that because it's my email inbox, but I clicked the link as Stevie, and this is what we see. Colt invited you to collaborate, accept or decline. So again, you can't just automatically add someone. It requires permission on both sides. I have to invite somebody and they have to accept. And so as Stevie, I will accept, but it does, it says, here's the information that Colt and other people will be able to have access to, your activity, where your request activity is coming from, basically country of origin, your IP address. Anyway, I'm going to hit accept. And now my view changes. I wasn't able to see this repository just a second ago because it's private, but now I'm a collaborator. If I go back to Colt's view, we see now, if I refresh the page, Stevie Chicks is listed as a collaborator. If I want to get rid of him or multiple collaborators, I can use checkboxes and then delete, but I am going to keep him as a collaborator. And so now, already we can see it's a private repo. Stevie has access to this repository. But what I'm going to demonstrate next is that Stevie also has push access. It's not just about viewing the project on GitHub, although that is new because it's private. He's a collaborator, he can view it. I can also clone and push my changes up. However, Stevie does not have access to settings, right? Stevie is not the owner. Stevie is a collaborator, but the owner is Colt. I'm the only one who sees settings. If I go to Stevie's side, that doesn't exist. So that is an important distinction. Being a collaborator, it's not like you can do everything, right? You can't delete the repository. I can't invite my own people here. I can't delete other people or remove their privileges. With different levels, different tiers, you definitely can have those features. Like organization and enterprise tiers, you on GitHub, you can have multiple owners. So permissions are different. So next up, I'll show you what it's like to collaborate and actually make some commits and push them up from two different accounts. Okay, so now it's time to show you the actual collaboration process. We will be talking at length about different workflows, different strategies for collaborating with Git in the next section. For now, I'm just going to show you, making a commit as Colt and then a commit as Stevie and pushing and pulling and working with multiple people. Okay, so nothing crazy. Same repo, we'll use this bookish disco, which is currently completely empty. The first thing we have to get out of the way, just quickly up front, is that normally to collaborate, you need more than one person, right? So I can't exactly collaborate with myself, but I can kind of fake it. I'll pretend to be two different users. I have two different GitHub accounts. That part is easy, right? I have one GitHub account for Colt, as we've already seen. That's in my Chrome window. And I have another GitHub account for Stevie that I'm using in Safari. So I can have those two things signed in at once. That's easy. It's just two different applications, two browsers. What is not as easy is having two different Git users active on my local machine, in my terminal. In fact, it's kind of annoying because if you remember setting up the SSH keys, it's a bit of a pain to set this up. So all that you need to know is that, yes, I'm working on one machine. This is all the same computer that I'm recording, but I've set it up in such a way that I have one Git user that I'll be working with on this window where it says Colt. It will be this same GitHub account, Colt. And then where it says Stevie, this terminal, I'll be working as a completely different GitHub user. So anything I do here will be as Stevie. Anything I do here will be as Colt. This is definitely not something you need to do. I don't recommend it. Just focus on being one user. That's how most people use Git. This is really just a conundrum I've run into to teach Git in collaboration. Okay, so yes, it's one computer, but imagine it's two separate computers across the globe from one another. So right now, nobody has done any work on this repository, bookish disco. So who's going to move first? Let's do Colt first. And according to GitHub rather, the instructions want us to do git init and then add a file or do some changes, then commit and then rename the branch to main and then add on this remote and then push. So yeah, we'll do that. We can do it that way, or we could just clone the empty repo, but we'll do git init, make sure we're not in anything. Let's actually do this in a folder. I'll call this bookish disco. You don't have to do that. All right, so git init, and then let's make a file in here. What's going to be in bookish disco? Maybe just a playlist, or how about artists.txt? Disco artist is what we'll put in there. And then I'll add that file, add artist.txt, whoops, git add artists, git commit. Let's just do initial commit, nothing exciting. Okay, so I have that file and I have that commit made by Colt. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is, if I'm going to follow these instructions, I'm going to rename my master branch to main. Of course, you do not have to do that, but that is what GitHub is asking us, or at least recommending these days. So we'll do it just to get more practice working with main instead of master. Okay, so now before I can push, I need to add a remote. So we add this remote here. We'll call it origin, as they tell us to do, using this URL. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter. We should have this new remote. There it is. Great. So now I can do a push. Git push origin main. That's the name of my branch. And there's just one commit. It's not an exciting commit. If I refresh, initial commit, we just made a file, artist.txt. All right. So it's on the main branch. And now if I'm Stevie over here, I refresh the page on Stevie's account. Remember, it shows Colt because that's who created the repo. But I'm on Stevie's account. You can see that here, signed in as Stevie Chicks. So we see, okay, there's stuff here now. Artist.txt, there's a single commit. So I want to get this on my machine and start working on it as Stevie. So Stevie could clone this. We copy that URL. And then we go to Stevie's terminal. And we make sure we're not in a repo. Okay. And then we clone. Okay, so we now have this folder, bookish disco. And I cd inside of it. We're on the main branch. Type git log. I'll make this a bit larger here. We see that we have that one commit from Colt, and that's it. So let's go ahead and make our own commit. We've got this artists file. Let's add on some disco artists, if that's what we're doing here. Let's do the Bee Gees. And then what else? How about Sylvester? And then we will add that. So git add artists, git commit -m, add to artists. Okay, so we're on the main branch. We now have a commit that we've added as Stevie Chicks. The other original commit came from Colt. This is from Stevie. Remember, two completely different laptops or machines across the globe from one another. We're collaborating. And I'm now going to push this up so that it's on GitHub and Colt can go and get it. So to do that, we need to push. See, our remote is called origin. So git push origin main. That's the branch we're working on. Come on. We refresh the page on GitHub and we see now we have two commits. Add to artist. That's the most recent change. There we go. So then the final part of this basic workflow of collaborating is as Colt, making sure I get these changes. So how would I get those changes? Well, there's a couple of options, but normally if I just want them on my main branch, I would just pull. So I'm now on Colt's machine and I don't have that most recent commit. So the easiest option is just to pull down. If we're looking for the main branch, it's the only branch we have, or if it's master or whatever it is. In this case, I'll just do a git pull origin main, and I'll pull down onto the branch I'm currently on. And it tells us, fast forward, right? We just got a commit that we didn't have. One file changed. I can see if I type git log, we now have that new commit from Stevie. And I could now do some more work and push that up and Stevie could pull down, right? If I take a look at the artist file, we have Bee Gees and Sylvester. We have officially collaborated across the globe using GitHub. So I created a GitHub repo. I added Stevie as a collaborator. Then I did some work, I pushed it up, Stevie cloned, and then Stevie did some work and pushed that up and I pulled down. So that's the most basic workflow. I just wanted to show you, how that works to have multiple people pushing. In the next section, we'll talk a lot more about potential workflows and the pros and cons of different approaches for collaboration. So we just talked about working with collaborators and adding collaborators and all of that. Now we're switching gears to talk about these things called README files. So you may remember, and you've probably seen it before, when we make a repo on GitHub, so if I just go new repository, I'm not going to actually make one. One of the options of 3 options here to initialize a repository with a file, one of them is add a README file. So what is that? README in all caps. Well, the README is a particular file that plays a special role on a GitHub repository. And it's not limited to GitHub, but in our context, we're talking about GitHub. It's a file that is supposed to explain what your project does, whether you're working on some API or a web application, a video game, or even if it's just, you're a government using GitHub to make laws and legislate. Whatever your repo is, the README file should include information about what the project does, what it's for, who's it for, how to get started with the project, how to run it and install dependencies if necessary, why it's noteworthy, who maintains the project, how to collaborate the project, how to get help. Not all of that has to be there, but if there's important information you want to convey to somebody coming to your project for the first time, then put it in the README file. So README in all caps, you'll see them all over the place if you haven't. And they're very important because if you put a README file in the root of your project, GitHub is automatically going to display it. It will render the contents on the page for us. So when I go to a repository like this, I just opened a couple trending repositories. This one here, Clean Architecture, it has a README file in the root of the directory, and it's automatically displayed for me. As you can see, it tells me the title, a little brief about what it does, a list of technologies, how to get started, how to configure things, how to configure the database, how to migrate, all this stuff. Keep going down, how to support or how to get support, the license that it's licensed under. Here's a different project. Same deal. It's called, what is this, Spacey? It's a tool for natural language processing in Python. Again, I just clicked a trending repo. It has a README file. And if I scroll down, that is what automatically GitHub detects, and it renders for users coming to this main repo page. So I see the title and all the stuff on the README. There's more information, where to ask questions, how to ask questions, features of this tool, how to install things, how to update, what else, how to compile from source, how to run the tests. Okay, so we're not limited just to software, although of course that's what a lot of GitHub repos are, but the README file, whatever is in it, is going to be automatically rendered if GitHub detects it in the root of your project. Also, I believe it will look in the .git folder, but almost everyone I've seen puts it right in the root of the directory. All right, so READMEs play an important role. It's the first thing somebody looks at when they come to your project. I mean, the title says it all, README. That's the goal, that's the aim here. If someone visits our, let's say React, visits a very large repository, this is like the entry point for people to learn more. And often it should include a bunch of links, learn how to use React, online playground. So this isn't even a very detailed README compared to some of the others we've seen, but it leads to tons of really important information for somebody who wants to know how to use React and how to contribute to React. There's a whole section about contributing, the code of conduct, contributing guide. So a bunch of stuff. That's really the role of READMEs. It's like the entry point for somebody to learn more about your project. And again, we can see the file here. It's just like any other file, except it is named something very particular, README in all caps, .md. So what is that MD? Well, it stands for Markdown. READMEs are Markdown files. If you're not familiar with the term, Markdown is a very succinct, convenient syntax to generate formatted text. It generates markup, Markdown, markup. And in the next video, I'll show you how we can write Markdown, and I'll show you an example of making a README. So that's coming up. All right, so readme.md is the name of the file. It's a Markdown file extension. In this video, we'll talk a little bit about Markdown itself, the syntax, and then in the next video, I'll make a README. So if you just want to see making a README, go ahead and skip this if you already know Markdown. So as I mentioned, Markdown is this tool that generates markup. This is the official project documentation. It's pretty thin. It's very simple, I guess. It says Markdown is text to HTML conversion tool for web writers. It allows you to write an easy to read, easy to write plain text format and then convert it to structurally valid XHTML or HTML. So for us, the benefit is that we can write this very succinct, hopefully easy to write and remember syntax that will then turn into HTML, and specifically GitHub will turn it into HTML for us. If we take a look at Let's see, one of these READMEs, like this space one here. Let's just go to the actual file, spacey. Here's README. This is what GitHub shows me, right? There's a lot of stuff here. I mean, all that text has to be written no matter what, but how would you indicate, how would you make code blocks or a table? As you can see, like this table here and all these links. If you know HTML, great, you can do that, but it still takes a lot of work. It's a lot of writing and additional syntax and HTML elements. So if we actually look at the raw Markdown, so this is the rendered, but this is the raw Markdown, it's a lot lighter weight. So it's still a lot of text because it's a long README. But if you take a close look, we'll see things like hash symbols or octothorpes, stars or asterisks. This is how you make things bolded. Here's how you make a heading, those not ampersands, the hash signs again. Here's how you make a table. Here's how you make links. So this syntax is then read by GitHub and displayed as the output HTML that is generated by Markdown. So Markdown is not specific to GitHub. People use Markdown all over the place. There are tools that allow you to view Markdown and render it yourself. There's extensions for VS Code. There are standalone applications that are just Markdown. And the one that I'll be using just in this video is this Markdown It demo. I'll include a link for it. So on the left, we can see some raw Markdown, and on the right is the generated HTML. So I can just show some very quick examples. To make headings, as you can see here, there are 6 levels of headings, just like in HTML. If you're familiar with HTML, we have 6 elements for headings, H1 down to H6. So to make the main heading on a page, of which there should usually just be one, we use a single hash sign, and then a space, and then some text. How about, I am a heading? And then you can see our automatically generated output over here. So this is HTML that Markdown makes for us. This is the HTML it made for me. So instead of having to write that or all of this, we can just write this. It's more compact and it's easier for most people to write. Even if there's a bit of a learning curve at the beginning, you just have to remember, what is the syntax to make a heading? All right, so one common pitfall is not putting spaces there. So that is no longer a heading. We need that space. And then if we have, 2, I won't show all 6, but if we have 2 hash signs versus 3, it's a smaller heading, and 3 is even smaller, all the way down to 6 is the smallest that we can get. Okay, so that's how we can make headings. You can make horizontal rules, those lines going across like this. I don't use that very often. And like this, I guess, 3 asterisks. There are a whole bunch of other things you can do. You can make these different symbols somewhat easily. I never remember this though. But what I do use somewhat frequently is making text bolded. So using asterisks, I'll type something like, hello there, everyone. And if I want to bold something, like I'll bold the word hello, I don't know why. I use 2 asterisks on either side, and you can see it is bolded. If I instead do 1 star on something on either side, it becomes italicized. So bold is 2 stars, 1 star or asterisk around something makes it italics. You can do the same thing to make something strike through using 2 tildes. Don't really do that myself. Now something I do pretty frequently is make block quotes. So block quotes start with a greater than sign, and they look like this right here. So I'll show a demo. Let's see. I'm trying to make this as big as I can. Hopefully this doesn't show up too small on the screen that you're watching this on. I am a block quote. There we are. It turns into this block quote that's being rendered for me. And I can have multiple lines. Right? If I just wrap over to the next line, it still is considered part of that same line, the same block quote. So that is important when we're working with Markdown. It considers just a chunk of text like this to be 1 paragraph. And if I want spacing, I don't just hit return like that. I have to have an actual empty line between them to generate 2 paragraphs. Additionally, we can make lists. So you can make an unordered list. Here they're showing doing it with plus signs. Usually I actually make my list like this with an asterisk. So first, and then another asterisk, seconds, right? That's how I can make a bulleted list, as you see there. So you can use a plus sign, a dash, or an asterisk to do that. And then you can make sub lists by indenting 2 spaces. So I could do an example of that. We indent 2 spaces and then another star, sub list. And you can see it is nested. It's further nested inside of that bullet. You can make ordered lists using numbers. I won't show you that, but you can see it here. And a really common important one is to make code blocks. So if you want a block of code, you can, first of all, just highlight a single line or a single phrase, or I guess a single line is what you would say, using these backtick characters. So we can put those backticks around like this word code, and you can see it's rendered this way. So I can do that on indented as an example. Those backticks, that key is usually located above the tab key on the left of a keyboard. And then you can also do blocks of code like this here, or this block here, by wrapping some code. So I'll just, I don't know, I'll type some random thing here, console.log hello, and then I'll duplicate that and just do 2 lines of code. So that's JavaScript. And if I wrap it with 3 backticks above and below, it turns into a block of code. And I can even add syntax highlighting if I use, like, this is JavaScript. So if I specify JS, now it's syntax highlighted as JavaScript. So this is just a very quick crash course in Markdown. It's not a huge topic, but we could spend a lot more time talking about the nuances of syntax highlighting and what languages are supported. Here's how you make tables. Personally, I find it a pain to make tables. In general, I don't use them that frequently in my READMEs. But anytime I do, I just copy from the docs. Now, links often trip students up. If you've ever worked on Reddit, by the way, if you've ever written Reddit comments, I forgot to mention this, that they use Markdown, or at least they used to. I think they still do. So to make a link, you can write the text of a link inside of square brackets, like, whoops, try and make this clear where I'm typing, like this, hello there, click me, and then immediately afterwards, we have parentheses, and then some link, like www.google.com. There we go. Now it has HTTP. And if I try and click on that, let's see, does it indeed take me to Google? Yes, it does. All right, so that's the basics of links. Then we have images. It's the same thing, except we add an exclamation point in front. So this is the URL to access that image. And then this would be the alternate text if that image doesn't load, or if they're using a screen reader to read this alt text. So let's see, what else is there? There's some stuff around emojis, superscript, subscript, there's footnotes, there's definition lists, abbreviations, there's a lot more. And on GitHub, there's even some additional functionality, but that's just a quick crash course. We're not going to spend a lot of time making fancy READMEs, but you obviously can. As you see here, I mean, this is a table. It's got a bunch of emojis. In the table, there are links, and they're bolded even. There's a lot of stuff going on in each one of these, right? We've got lists, headings, horizontal rules, as you can see that line. Well, hopefully it shows up on the screencast. It's a little delicate. So there's a lot of stuff. Code blocks, syntax highlighted code blocks. So we saw basically how we do this. We just would have to put all those pieces together. And in the next video, I'll show the process of making a README, pushing it up, and writing some basic Markdown. So let's try making our own README for this idiotic bookish disco repository. I just have to decide if I'm going to make that as Colt. I guess, sure, let's do it as Colt, and then we'll push it up and then pull down as Stevie. It doesn't matter who makes it. It just needs to end up in this repository. And this is normally something you do pretty early on, though you don't have to. Honestly, a lot of the time you might be working on a project and you don't expect anybody to ever see it. You don't expect it to surface, to see the light of day publicly. And then you decide, actually, maybe this is useful to other people. Let me put it online. I need to add a README. So it's not something you have to do at the beginning. But it is definitely a good practice to get into. And also, I forgot to mention this about READMEs. They are probably the one thing that a recruiter, a non-technical person would see if they're looking at your projects. They're not going to look at the code, right? They're probably not going to read over the particular files on this project if I happen to have made this. But at least this gives them some gateway, some entry point where they can try and gauge, or at least maybe understand the point of this whole project. Anyway, back to Bookish Disco. Let's make sure I'm up to date here. Okay, so I can make the README. Technically, I can just make it on GitHub, right? I can do this, add file, and make it here, and then pull down as Colt and pull down on Stevie's machine. But I'll make it locally. Before I do anything, I should always make sure that I have the latest changes. So I'll do git pull origin main. I don't think there isn't any changes, right? We still have, already up to date, but just a good practice. It just makes it easier so I don't have to deal with like merges or something after I've made the README. So I'll make the README file. It should go in the root of my directory conventionally. So the root of my Git repository, the project. So I'll make that file, .md, it's just a markdown file. So here it is, readme.md, and then I can just put some super basic stuff in here. We'll do a heading like we saw in the previous video if you watched it, just the main heading. How about Bookish Disco? And then below that, we could even copy a README. So below, we'll put a little paragraph of text that just says what it is. Maybe something like Bookish Disco is a repository name generated by GitHub. Okay, Bookish Disco is a repository name randomly generated by GitHub. This project does nothing. It is purely a demo for a course on Git/GitHub. Okay, so there's our basic repository, or our basic Markdown file so far. If you're using VS Code, you can actually preview Markdown if you have a Markdown file, .md. If you open the command palette and then type Markdown or M, and it just comes up for me, recently used, Markdown open preview, this is what we're dealing with. We've got our heading, and we've got our little text there. And maybe we'll get fancy. We'll do some bold around Bookish Disco. Okay, so that's our basic README file. Now I'm gonna add that, right? Git add README, git commit-m, add README file. And now we'll push this up, git push origin main. Now we refresh our page for Bookish Disco, and there it is. We've got our lovely README showing up. So the file is here, the commit is here, but also GitHub is rendering it for me automatically. It detected README. So it doesn't do that for any other file. It's a special name it's looking for, and that's kind of it. That's readme.md, right? We could spend a lot of time making it look nicer, but we're not going to. This project has no purpose other than to demonstrate how READMEs work and how, I guess, collaboration can work. So the last thing we should do, though, is go over to Stevie, right? He has the same repo, Bookish Disco, and he does not have this README. He does not have that latest commit locally, right? That's the last commit he has is add to artists. He does not have this file for the README. So he doesn't have any changes that he's made. So we're just going to pull down, git pull, origin, and then main. If that's the branch, it's the only branch. We'll pull down, and now we have that README, type git log, new commit. So just another example of somebody doing some work, pushing it up, and then somebody else, another collaborator, pulling it down. And that's all there is to READMEs. The next GitHub feature we'll cover are gists. So GitHub gists are a very simple way to share code snippets. If you're familiar with something called Pastebin, it's a very similar tool. It allows you to basically copy some code into a gist and then save that and share it with other people or refer back to it later. You don't have access to all the GitHub repo features, but you have access to some of them, like forking, for example. So I'll just demonstrate it. First, to access gists, not over there, over here, if you go to GitHub, I go to gist.github.com. Now, I'm sure there's a button somewhere. I think it's actually, if we go here to your profile and then your gists, I think that's the easiest way to get there. Maybe there's another way without just typing gists.github.com. So it's a different page, right? We see my personal list of gists, actually. I don't use them very frequently on this account. Most of these are from when I was teaching lectures, but I could just show you one. Let's say here was some exercise I made for students. So this is an HTML file. Okay, so there's this HTML file. I don't remember what this exercise was, what I was asking students to do. But there's the ability to leave comments. I can personally, delete this file or edit this file. I can download it. I can share it with people. They can fork it and star it. So I'll show you, if I go to all gists, I can see a discovery page. So these are gists that other people have made. So they range from Markdown files. Like, I don't know exactly what this is. It looks like some sort of checklist for turning in work, maybe, on GitHub. So there's whoever this person is made that gist, and it's public. But here's another one. This looks like some sort of iOS script. So here's a Swift script. There's 2 files, which we can do. And then you can make private gists as well. So I use these when I'm teaching to share stuff, but you'll see them occasionally, like on Reddit or different web pages. People will share code this way. A full GitHub repository where you have to push up and set up your remotes and all of that can be annoying. This you can do very easily. So if I want to make a new gist, it's just a matter of clicking the plus sign here, and then I enter a file name. So what do I want to share with somebody, or what do I want to store in a gist? Well, actually, here's a gist I've been using personally as I'm making this course, where I've set up my computer to have 2 different GitHub accounts, and it's been kind of frustrating to have to switch between them. But this is a gist that somebody made to share. This person, Owen Nguyen. I am very sorry. I'm sure I completely butchered that. Anyway, this gist talks about having multiple GitHub accounts, wanting to use them both on the same computer, how to set up your SSH config file, which is exactly what I did. I followed these instructions, how to add the 2 private keys, how to test your connection. And then it allows people to discuss and, post about their error messages or other suggestions. So this is very, very useful. It could have been a full-fledged GitHub repo with just 1 file in it, but a gist is more appropriate. So if I wanted to just try recreating some of this myself, this happens to be a Markdown file, right? So .md, a lot of gists are Markdown, but they can be any file extension. I'm just going to copy this to show you. I'll delete this. I'm not plagiarizing his work. Okay, so I can now name this. I'll call this, I don't know, GitHub, how about multiple GitHub ssh.md. And if I do that .md, it now highlights it as Markdown. And then I can choose to create a secret gist or a public gist. I'll just create a secret one. I can add a description. I'll create it. And now I have this gist that I can come back to at any point. And that's pretty much all that there is to a secret gist. I can edit it. I can write some comments. I can also have gists, I believe, within the company that I work at, and share gists with people, keep them secret so they're not public facing, but have collaborators. I can edit. Whoops, that's just the raw. I can edit this way. I can even add files. So I could add some other file, like a JavaScript file, and it will highlight it as JavaScript. Hopefully you can see that. I guess it's a bit small. There you go. So it's getting JavaScript syntax highlighting. And that's kind of all that there is to gists. So this one, again, is secret. It's private, but I could make a new gist and instead just make it public here. And anybody could see that on my account, and anybody can see anybody else's public gists. As you saw here, there's this discovery feature. I never ever really use this, I guess, except for this video where I'm showing you it. It's pretty rare that I just want to stumble across random gists. Anyway, that's all there is to GitHub gists. You can have multiple files, different file types, different extensions. You can share them. You can keep them secret. They are, I believe, behind the scenes actual Git repositories, although they don't expose the same features on GitHub that we normally have access to with a full-fledged repo. But we can see revisions. We can see diffs. So there is a history here, but they're just very slimmed down. The actual interface is very streamlined compared to a full GitHub repository. So that about wraps it up for GitHub gists. So next up, we're going to talk about GitHub Pages, a pretty fun is the wrong term, I guess useful feature of GitHub is that we can actually host web pages out of GitHub repositories for free, very easily, with basically a single click of a button. Once our code is up on GitHub, we can host a website. Now, there are some restrictions. This is not a full-fledged hosting service. You can't do anything except static web pages. So that means no server-side languages like Python, Ruby, or Node. You're purely HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's what you're limited to, client-side static pages. But you can still create really amazing portfolio websites or documentation websites for your repositories. You can host, if you build a JavaScript game, you can use GitHub Pages to host that. But you don't want to use GitHub Pages for any like high capacity website where you're expecting a lot of traffic. It's not really meant for that. But it's a really nice feature. And again, it's free and it's built into GitHub. So it makes hosting very, very easy for certain situations. So I'm going to show you some examples. Here's the GitHub Pages homepage where they explain how it works. There's a video you can watch. Then they have the instructions. But if we go to a project like Faker, which is a JavaScript library, this is the actual project on GitHub, right? It's open source. This is the entire repository, all the collaborators, or contributors rather. If I scroll down though, there's a link right here to view the documentation. So it's not the most beautiful website, but it is documentation. It has to do with the library Faker. It's okay if you have no idea what it is, but this is docs for this project. And if you notice this URL, it has GitHub in the URL, github.io. So all GitHub pages are going to use that domain, github.io. You can change that. You can actually customize it and set it up to use your own URL, but I'm not going to go into that. But that tells us this is actually hosted thanks to GitHub Pages. And here's another example. This is a repository. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. Here we are. This repository is a fork of that 2048 game where this person here, Ovolve created a solver, an AI solver for the popular game 2048. So we can see the code here, but also thanks to GitHub Pages, there's this URL I can go to view the website. And I don't know if you can see this. I'll zoom in, hopefully. It's ovolve.github.io/2048AI. So it has GitHub in there again, github.io. So this is another example where there's the actual repository. There's a README, there's information about the project, but then there's a corresponding website, and it happens to be hosted by GitHub. Same thing that we saw with Faker. Here is the project, the repository on GitHub, and here's a website that goes along with that project. It pertains to that project, and it has GitHub in that URL as well. So there are two flavors of GitHub Pages. There are user sites and project sites. So I'm going to focus on project sites. For every single GitHub repository you create, you can have a corresponding hosted website. So that is, every single repo you make, every project, you can have your own corresponding website. And the default URLs are going to follow this pattern. Whatever your username is, so I'm Colt, it's my username, colt.github.io / and then whatever my repo name is, portfolio or 2048 clone or something like that. So that's one per project. Then there's also user sites. You are limited to one of those, one per GitHub account. And this is a different application. It's actually set up differently as well. I'm not going to spend as much time on it, but this is where you could host something like a personal website, a portfolio, anything that you want to be based upon your username.github.io. So colt.github.io, samanthajones.github.io, where it's not a project, it's not a particular repository. Instead, it's about you or your group, your organization. You are allowed one per GitHub account. But we're going to focus on project sites, like the two that I showed you. We have a repo here, and then a corresponding documentation website. And then we have another repo here, and then just a deployed version of this project that we can interact with. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to set this up. It is very simple. Now, you will need to know a little bit of HTML just to make websites, but the actual mechanism to turn it on with GitHub Pages is very easy. So that's coming up. All right, so I'm now going to explain. Wow, I just realized this says GitHub Pages. That's annoying. Well, I'm now going to explain and demonstrate creating a GitHub Pages hosted website for a simple repository. The first step is to make a repository or pick some repository that we want to create a GitHub page for. So I'm just going to make a new repository quickly. I'm going to call this one chickens. It will be public. I'm not going to put anything in there to begin with. And then locally on my machine, I don't yet have a repository. So I'm going to init. And let's say that this repository is a list of chicken breeds or chicken names or something. So I've got this chickens.txt file I just created. We'll add a commit. So git add chickens, git commit, initial commit. Nothing crazy, nothing to do with the website yet. I'll add some chickens into that list. Let's see, we've got Australorps and Barnvelders. I'm just copying and pasting some of these. So I'm just going to put some chickens in there. It really doesn't matter. Whatever the content of this is, it's not a website. And that's what I want to show you, is that I can have some completely standalone project that is not a website, but then I can create a branch where I build out a GitHub Pages website. So this will be our basic project, our starting point. I'll go ahead and add and commit. Add, I don't know, some chicken breeds. All right, and then I want to get this up on GitHub. So I guess we'll rename to main just to follow what GitHub wants. Optional, of course. And then I will add my remote. So I'm just going to rename master to main. Then I'll add my remote. And then I'll just push up, literally just copying and pasting. I'll push up what we've done. All right. So now we have, if I refresh one more time, we have some work up here. Very simple, but imagine it's some complicated repository like that Faker project I showed you. Now, if I want to set up a GitHub Pages website, all that I have to do is select some branch that I'm going to tell GitHub contains a website. And specifically, it's going to look for a file called index.html. So I don't have that on here at all right now. But if I did, I go to settings and then scroll all the way down to this, almost to the bottom, right above the danger zone, GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages is currently disabled. Select a source below to enable it, and I have to pick a branch. So I'm not going to select main because currently there's no HTML file, no index.html on the main branch, but also I want to demonstrate that you can have some project on the main branch and have no website, and then on a separate branch, set up a website. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a new branch here, git switch-c, and I'll just call this one gh-pages. You don't have to name it that. Actually, I think in the past you did. Now you can make any branch you want, the designated GitHub Pages branch, so you don't need that. And now I'm going to make an index.html, and I might even delete that chickens file. Whoops, git status. And then I'm going to add those changes. I'll commit and just say add index.html. Okay, so now I have this HTML file, and it does need to be called index. And if you don't know HTML, that's not a huge deal, but basically I'm just going to fill out some very simple HTML in here. Maybe I'll just put a heading, chickens, like that. And then, I don't know, I guess that's probably it. Maybe a paragraph that has some lorem ipsum text. So imagine that this is my website that I want to host using GitHub Pages. All right, so that's what it looks like, index.html. I'm now going to add and commit, git add index, git commit. I'm on this branch, GitHub Pages, git commit -m, and what should I do here? Right, add basic HTML. Cool. So now I'm going to push this branch up, git push origin, and then gh pages. So now I should have two branches up here. One that is my very complicated, just use your imagination, very complicated repository, big project, I don't know what it is, a Python project or something, an open source library. And then the second branch contains a lovely website It's not hosted anywhere yet, but it is a single HTML file. So all I need to do now is go into settings and tell GitHub Pages, or tell GitHub, that I want to use GitHub Pages on the branch gh-pages. And I believe it automatically detected that name. So that's kind of the conventional name a lot of people use. And it looks like it's set up to automatically detect that. But I want to be very clear. You can name that branch anything. I could make it the main branch that is hosted. But I'm going to go with gh-pages. And then it asks me to select a folder where it will find the index.html file. And ours is just in the root of the repository. The other place you can do is a docs folder, but we just want it, or at least the way I have it right now, it's just index in the root of the repository. So that's good. That's all we need. This is how you can set up a custom domain. I'm not going to do that. But here it shows me your site is ready to be published at cult.github.io/ the name of my repository, which is chickens. So it often takes a little while, especially on the first, well, no, I'm wrong. It's already up here. But sometimes it can take a couple of minutes. But here's my hosted website, right? It's not beautiful, but colts.github.io/chickens. You could go to this right now, and I'm actually going to change this a bit so you won't see this, but you'll see the website. And then I can continue to make changes to my other branches, right? I can build out the rest of this main branch and have a whole bunch of changes and files and collaborators, but then separately decide that I want to update the website. All I do is push new code up to GitHub Pages, gh-pages. That's the name of the branch. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to update this HTML file a little bit and make it somewhat nicer. Here's a code pen that I found by this guy, Caesar C, and I want to use this text, this animated SVG. So I'm just going to basically adapt this. I'm going to say chickens instead. And then I'm going to copy the corresponding HTML and CSS. This is actually written with something called Pug. I want the compiled HTML. This really has nothing to do with GitHub Pages, but anyway, I'm going to copy this and put it in my HTML file. I'll get rid of everything else in the body. And then I'm going to look at the compiled CSS, copy all of that, and I'm going to make a CSS file. I'll call it app.css and put all of this in there. All right. And now I need to link to that CSS file, app.css. That's the name of that file. Great. And then I'm just going to add and commit that. So git add app.css. I'll just do an add dot, I guess. And then git commit -m. I don't know, add animated text to index. All right. So I'm on the GitHub Pages branch still. So git push origin gh-pages. So I've modified my website, the index.html file. On this branch, I push that branch up. We go back and just make sure that code is now here. If I look at that branch, right, we have app.css and our new version of index. And then if I go to the URL where it's currently served, Colt, my username, .github.io/chickens, I refresh. It happened quickly. I recorded this video earlier today and had to throw it away. It was taking like 20 minutes to update, but this time I got lucky. And this is our hosted web page. I will leave it as this. You could go to this URL yourself and view it. I'm not paying to host this, right? GitHub is doing it for free. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean you should use it for important projects or things with high stakes, but for portfolios or for personal websites, for documentation for small projects, just to demonstrate a project, GitHub Pages is a great resource. So all you do, again, is for a project, make some branch, or it could be your main branch, and then go into settings and designate that branch as the GitHub Pages branch. So I could change this over to be main, but there's no index HTML there, so we won't actually see a web page. But if I did, if I had an index on main, I could serve that instead, and I would see it here. So I push up my code, push up changes to that branch, up to my GitHub repo, and then wait a moment, refresh. It might be more than a moment, but a couple of minutes, hopefully at most, and I'll see those changes reflected here. So that is GitHub Pages, a really, really nice resource. It's free and pretty simple to use compared to a lot of hosting services. But again, remember, it is limited to static sites. This is not a full-fledged hosting service for full web applications with backends, but still, we are very thankful for it.